Yeah, I just look the same colour as the wall. If I stand still, I fade into the wall. Hello and welcome to episode 33 of Great Things with Great Tech, the podcast highlighting companies doing great things with great technology. My name is Anthony Spiteri, and in this episode, we're talking to a company that is cloud-native application security leader, and today enables 2.2 million developers to build securely. Now, they have a vision to empower every modern developer in the world to develop first and stay secure. That company, in its short history, has raised $750 million and already has done 4 acquisitions, and is most recently valued at about $5 billion. That company is Snyk, and I'm talking to Lawrence Crowther, Head of Solution Engineering for APJ. Welcome to the show, Lawrence.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Anthony. Nice to be here.
Awesome, good stuff. So just before we talk about Snyk and security and DevSecops, we'll talk a little bit about what that all means. If you like great things with great tech and would like to feature in future episodes, you can click on the link in the show notes or go to launch.gtwgt.com and register your interest. Just as a reminder, all episodes are available on the GTWGT YouTube channel. If you haven't subscribed yet, click to the link at the bottom. And GTWGT is on all popular podcasting platforms, distributed via Anchor FM, but also obviously it goes out to Apple, Spotify, Google Podcasts, all the great podcasting platforms. And that will keep you up to date with all previous 32 episodes. So with that, let's get into Snyk. And Lawrence, let's firstly go into the history, because Snyk is a company, it's not too old, founded in 2015. But before we dive into some of the initial history and facts, just tell us about the name. The number one, where it came from, but also I've pronounced it right, but let's talk a little bit about that, because I think it's one of those companies where when you look at the name, the pronunciation isn't that obvious to start with. So let's kick off with that.
Yeah, good question. It is pronounced Snyk, and it stands for "so now you know." Think of sneak, sneakers. Some people in Europe call it Snyk, but
yeah.
most people in Asia Pacific and the US, North America, pronounce it Snyk. I guess you can think of it, you're sneaking around the applications or network, so it has a double meaning there. But no, it stands for "so now you know," which is sort of a geeky security type term as well.
Yeah, it's quite cool. It's obvious, right? So now you know. So don't you know about the name? Well, now you know. So that's quite a great play on it as well. And to be fair, I actually thought Snyk, like sneaking around the network, I thought that was where it actually was more derived from, like just a cool way to say that. But the fact that it kind of forms like "so now you know," that's even cooler in terms of name. So, this company, like you guys have won some great accolades already in a short period of time. So CNBC's Disruptor 50 in 2021, Forbes Top 100 Cloud Companies 2020. There's all sorts of, even happiest employers. So Snyk, from the outside, is doing something well. So let's talk about the founding and history leading up to today, and exactly why the company has been built up to, be quite successful today and is now pretty much a market leader in the space. So in 2015, Snyk was founded by Guy Pajani. And his sort of belief was that the future of security depended on developer adoption. So, Lawrence, just maybe talk a little bit about that and why the company was founded and its growth since then.
Yeah, man, Guy was kind of a visionary in this space. Had sold a company previously to Akamai in a similar space, and had worked in sort of application security sort of most of his career. So definitely a well-known figure in the industry. And what he saw with the existing sort of scanning tools in the market is that they weren't built for developers. So he took the opportunity to build what he calls a dev-first security company. In fact, if you hear him these days, he talks about Snyk being actually more of a developer tooling company than an actual security company, which is an interesting concept we can sort of dig into later. But essentially, and we'll cover this in more detail, is we integrate closely with a developer toolchain. So it almost makes Snyk invisible, such that they can get on and deliver features into production without having those traditional security gates that are imposed by the traditional security vendors.
Okay. So through the company's history, I mean, early 2015, the company's building a product. 2016, you're scaling R&D, looking to, the product is received in the community. And then into 2017, you sort of were starting to break into, that mid-market SMB, and you're trying to sort of build mind share in the developer community. What does that mean in the developer world? Because obviously, me being platform infrastructure, I kind of understand how companies see themselves with certain models and certain go-to-markets in their early years. But what did that mean from a Snyk point of view?
Yeah, I think we started with the SMB and sort of the tech companies or the digital natives because they didn't have the legacy and they can obviously build on the cloud first. But what they do have in common with all companies actually is building their applications using open source libraries effectively. So that's really where we started and cut our teeth is building a tool to help scan the open source software that you're using in a project.
Okay. Yeah.
And the reason why this is tricky is because if you start using open source libraries, then themselves bring in other dependencies from the internet that you don't know who's written the code, what it's doing, right? Or where is it in your project? So a lot of companies leave themselves exposed because they have this huge dependency tree of open source software. And that's where actually most of the vulnerabilities lie in those dependencies.
Yeah, and I kind of equate that to in my world. If I'm deploying a package on Linux specifically, right, and I'm trying to compile something, and then it goes, okay, you haven't got dependency X, go download that, and then that kind of follows down the tree of then dependency 2, 3, 4, and you just kind of blindly go and download these things because you think you need them or you need them, right? But thinking back, and I've only just kind of put this together, it could be anything that you're getting, right? Like, I mean, anything could be in there, but you kind of blindly accept that this is required and this is part of your compiling procedure, and then it's in the system, and then forever may it be until it lives, until there could be something hiding within that causes some sort of security issue later on. So is that kind of a similar analogy?
Absolutely, 100%. Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, hackers know that people aren't checking all these vulnerabilities, so there's lots of different techniques that attackers will use to exploit open source software. They're in the most common open source packages that you use, but developers and security teams are simply unaware that they're even using these malicious libraries in the first place.
Yeah, good stuff. So, moving just through the history before we get into the guts of what you guys do. So in 2018, it's when you sort of ramped up sales, which is interesting, right? So for the first 3 years, it's really just about product, getting it out there, developing it, finding the space in the market. Along the way, you've been able to, secure some funding. I mentioned 750 million, which is a tremendous amount of funding. I think it's up to Series E funding at the moment as well, from what I saw. And then in 2019 is when I think, you guys really came to the fore, definitely came on my radar. We've got like a little bit of a link here in terms of, the Vima I work, my ex-CEO, Peter McKay, is now your CEO. So there's a great link there. But in 2019, it's when you really scaled, you go to market. I think you hired Peter in late, or Peter came on board. He was involved in the company beforehand. But that's when I guess you guys really started your proper go to market. So, what kind of flipped around in that period of time to really make you guys, effectively the powerhouse that you are today?
Yeah, so we went from a single product company into a dual product and started to build out a platform. So as I mentioned, the first product was all around that open source scanning. We saw a big shift in people adopting containers. Maybe we got there too late, 2019. There was already widespread adoption of containers, but we built a product to specifically scan your container images as well.
Okay.
You mentioned Linux, right? Obviously, most of the world's containers are built on Linux, which also bring in open source shared libraries into that runtime environment. And then you're running your applications on top of that. So we scan the whole thing. So we wanted to really enter that sort of cloud native security space as people were sort of containerizing workloads and shifting to microservices running in the cloud. We needed actually to become part of that movement because developers actually were taking ownership of this phenomenon as well, right? Because developers sort of dictate how those containers get constructed and what software is ultimately going to run on those containers.
Yeah.
And developers are sort of defining how that works in production even. So we needed to provide another set of tooling for developers to keep the code safe.
Yeah, it's really interesting, and it's I've been talking to quite a few containerization companies, Kubernetes companies, and that you're right. That cloud native landscape is tremendously broad. It's kind of like it's still kind of the Wild West, right? There's just so much fluidity in it. There's so many different moving parts, so many different companies, so many open source projects, contributing to it. That you're right. It must be like a nightmare for a security guy to basically, be across that. But the problem is with the security guys, typically they're not the devs, right? As well, like you got a security guy who's a very set in his way. He's cut from a particular cloth. Developers, I think, we all know can be a little bit, what's the word, gun-ho. They're a little bit mercenary-like. They're just doing their thing. So, and because we've kind of almost flipped the script, and in the world of cloud native, in the world of containerization, they're in control of the direction of the application, and they're dictating the way that the businesses are going. I mean, one of the topics, one of the narratives that I wanted to talk about was Snyk exists in a world where applications and software is consuming and becoming the number one focus of all businesses, really, because any business worth their salt is now going to basically have a core line of business software running somewhere. And typically it's not an off-the-shelf product. It's something that they're internally developing, especially if you're in that higher sort of enterprise sort of SME level. What bridge does Snyk offer to sort of say, okay, here's a developer, here's a security guy, here's the platform guy. How does Snyk interact with that?
Yeah, I mean, the question, I guess, is what is the role of these personas, right, in the new world, developer security and operations for that matter, right? And I think we'll get into more detail later, but essentially the role of the security architect is shifting into providing the tooling and the infrastructure and the guidelines, if you will, for developers to sort of work within. Traditionally, security folks would be engaged late in a project life cycle as sort of the penultimate or the last thing you need to do before you go to production. And what we're seeing a shift in, though, is security folks getting involved from day one, as well as operations folks or DevOps folks, so they can define the guidelines and be on the same page in terms of what they need to do to sort of develop fast but stay secure and get those applications to production as quick as possible, without sort of compromising any internal process or breaking any sort of production rules or anything like that.
Yeah, and I think the best way to articulate, I think, what you just said is, and what I'll do in the show notes, I'll post a link to, you've got a great page on your website that shows you, I think it shows you 3 or 4 of your products and basically shows what they do. I think that's the best visualization to actually appreciate what you guys do the most, because it certainly was what I used to kind of fully understand where you guys fit in that process. But you're right, what you talked about, from injecting yourselves during the coding stage. I mean, you're in those kind of coding tools like Visual Studio. You're basically preempting any potential threat before it goes into a staging or before it goes into a production scenario with a live piece of software, which is obviously when it's at its most dangerous, because then it is unleashed on the network, it's open, it's exposed. So you guys are kind of making sure that everything is in check before it actually goes into prod. You've also got infrastructure as code tooling as well. That kind of came in the last year. So, how does that fit into it as well? Is that just kind of a similar expansion of the containerization platform?
Not necessarily. I mean, you can still use infrastructure as code without containers, but obviously most people are. I would say, if you are treating your configuration scripts and your sort of declarations for your infrastructure and the way the applications get deployed as code, and they're checked into a repository, then it's natural for a developer to take ownership of that piece as well.
Mm-hmm.
And at the end of the day, it is just code, right? You've got a YAML file or a Terraform file which has a bunch of instructions in it.
Yeah.
And just like any other code, like Java or JavaScript, there can be bugs or misconfigurations in it as well. For example, you may leave sort of network ports open, or you may expose files inadvertently, or you may be running workloads as a privileged user or as root, right? Which is not ideal, right? Because if those containers or applications get hacked, people can do nasty things, right?
Yeah.
So what the Snyk infrastructure as code product is doing is looking for patterns in those files. So we support Terraform, CloudFormation, Kubernetes, YAML, and Helm charts at the moment, and it's looking for areas where people might be lazy or forget to do things like encrypt passwords, or they may leave private security keys in the file, which is often how a lot of these attacks are happening in production, right?
Yeah, okay, and that's a really good use case, and I think this is the bridge, and I wanted to touch on it later on, but I think this is the bridge where infrastructure guys who are doing more coding for infrastructure as code, they're consuming infrastructure in that way. You're right. It's kind of, again, the case of, let's just try and deploy something. I've copied this particular Terraform example from a GitHub repository. I'm porting it across. I'm going to change a couple of settings, and now I'm going to use it for my own infrastructure, right? There's inherent security risks in there. It's almost like you're just trusting, other people have put in there. So this is where I think Snyk has this crossover effect. So, obviously the DevSec world is significant, but I think for a lot of infrastructure guys moving forward, where they really have to be aware of what they're deploying, how they're deploying it, and then is it secure as well. So if this comes into play at that bottom level before everything's deployed, then it's obviously going to be useful for them as well. So I think that's pretty cool. So you're covering effectively all the gambits.
Just on that.
Yeah, go ahead.
Just a good example for the listeners maybe is the SolarWinds attack, right?
Yeah.
It happened because a file was deployed in GitHub with the password in plain text. The password being SolarWinds123, but that allowed attackers to get into a build server and inject the malware after the software was built, right? And then distribute through the software supply chain.
Yeah.
So that's a sort of example of a misconfiguration, if you will, in infrastructure scripts that obviously having a tool like Snyk would have found.
Yeah, and actually, funnily enough, so I did that myself. I wrote a blog post on it, and I get kind of reminded of it quite often. But effectively, I was doing some Terraform stuff, and I uploaded a bit of code to GitHub, and I left my AWS secret key and access key in there. Realized within, literally within 3 minutes, I realized what I'd done. I saw it up there. I'll just delete it. It's too late. It had been scraped. And within 5 minutes, my account had been locked out. The guys came in and built like infrastructure all around the world. I had a $20,000 bill within a couple of minutes. It was obviously that ended up okay. I didn't have to pay $20,000. But it was a really great example of what you just talked about at a smaller level, right? Which I think happens quite often. Accidental uploads of a secret key. It's something that you can do really easily. So if you've got something that says, hey, don't do that, or hey, you're doing this, are you sure you want to continue? That's got power and utility as well, right?
Exactly, yeah. All
right, so I guess rounding out the history, we're still kind of talking about history, but I wanted to talk about the acquisitions because it's so, like, it just shows where you guys are heading, I think, the strength of the company. Again, $750 million worth of funding, Series E, but what is it, 4 acquisitions as well within that time?
Yeah, basically 4 within the last 18 months, actually.
Wow. Okay, so 4 within 18 months. And what's the kind of, what type of companies are you acquiring? Are they in a similar space, or are they something that you guys you don't have and you want to add to your portfolio? What's the kind of nature of those acquisitions?
One was sort of an acqui-hire. So Manifold was sort of a multi-cloud service marketplace. We acquired those guys mainly for the engineering talent to build out our platform at scale. I'll talk about sort of the platform side in a minute.
Yeah, that'd be good.
So that was more for the sort of engineering talent. One was Greenkeeper, which was an open source dependency scanning tool, very similar to our open source scanning tool. So again, sort of acquiring that IP and then the developers for that project. Next, we acquired late last year a company called DeepCode, which was a leader in the SAST space. SAST is static application security testing. So that's scanning proprietary or custom code.
Okay.
And that's really how we added our fourth product, Snyk Code, for doing the static code analysis for customers' sort of proprietary code. And then we acquired just recently, a few months back, a company called FOSS-ID, which is a pretty small company, also in the open source scanning sort of market. But they had some interesting sort of IP that we wanted. One was they scanned legacy code like C++, C, and even COBOL, actually.
Oh, okay, okay.
I'm not sure how many folks are building, cloud native applications in COBOL these days. But anyway,
I was going to say, if you were to mention like Pascal or something, I'd be like, oh, that's even more.
It uses a different approach without getting into the sort of details, but it can scan sort of any file on a file system, basically.
Okay.
Whereas we focus more on the package managers.
Yeah.
We'll talk about that. So, but FOSS-ID had another pretty cool feature called open source snippets. So, I mean, I was developing code for more than 10 years, right? I'm definitely guilty of this. Going on to Stack Overflow and copying and pasting code, and you putting it into my IDE and just, making sure it works, and then checking it into the GitHub, and off you go, without really sort of understanding the inherent risks of that block of code, right? It could have vulnerability. So FOSS-ID sort of scans these block of codes with a knowledge database to determine the hash or the signature of that code to see if it's a match, and therefore sort of tell you that this code has a vulnerability. It may have like a SQL injection or a cross-site scripting or something in the code, so you need to know about that. And FOSS-ID also was pretty good at the compliance and governance side, looking at sort of open source license usage. So they're the sort of primary features or reasons why we acquired them.
Yeah.
They're a pretty small company, only about 30 to 40 people globally.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So just adding, but like you're saying, like seeing what some companies are doing really well from their focus and just taking it on and inquiring it. That's the nature of acquisitions, right? It's filling those spaces. And interesting to see that you've already, like I saw the code up there as a product. So quick integration as well, basically as well, and a flip around to really bring them into the company. Yeah. So you mentioned
one thing,
go ahead.
just on the deep code thing, which might be interesting as well. One of the cool features they had, and one of the reasons why we acquired them, is they use artificial intelligence, and they scan hundreds of thousands of open source projects online on the internet, on GitHub and other places, and sort of recognize different patterns. When an open source project had a vulnerability, how was it fixed? How was it patched? And using that information, tries to reduce the noise, or we call them false positives, for the developers, so they can focus on the true vulnerabilities rather than getting thousands of alerts, if you will.
Yeah.
So it helps to get more accuracy in that, and makes the developer's job a little bit more easier in that sense.
Good stuff. Awesome. You mentioned the platform before, so talk a little bit about the platform. Maybe talk about what the actual application is like. How do you? Is it a control plane where people log in and they basically deploy agents or insert plugins? How does it actually do its thing across the board?
Yeah, good question. Yeah, so we've accumulated all this IP, and we have 4 sort of individual products, although somewhat interrelated, right? Especially like IAC and containers, and even open source, right? But we do have sort of platform level features that cut across all the different solutions, right? Things like license compliance, things like the ability to set policies across all of your projects, no matter which type of project, across the organization. So we're investing a lot in that sort of platform side. No, but it's delivered basically over as a SaaS product.
Okay.
You sign up, and we support most of the major Git source control systems. So GitHub or Git Enterprise if you're doing Git on-prem, GitLab, Bitbucket from Atlassian, Azure repos. So most of the sort of source control systems that folks are using out there. And basically you point Snyk at your repos and you start importing projects. Now, the interesting thing is that if you have a project that has all of the elements I talked about, so obviously it will have code, right? So we'll scan the code. It's definitely going to have open source libraries as well. So we'll scan those. It probably has like a Docker file too, the definition of the container. So we'll scan that. And it probably has your infrastructure as code, like a YAML file for Kubernetes or Terraform file in the repo itself. This is what I meant by developers taking ownership, because they're the ones in control of that repo.
Yeah, end to end.
And so they sort of defined how this is going to get deployed on all the different pieces. So we will scan all of those at once and give you sort of a breakdown of, here are the open source vulnerabilities. Here are the potential vulnerabilities that are going to be in the container once it gets constructed. And it's not just the sort of base image in the container, it's the user layer as well, like any software that gets installed as part of the Docker file definition. Here's the vulnerabilities you're going to get in your IAC layer as well. And then, of course, the code analysis, static code analysis. It's all in one sort of view at a project level.
Okay. Yeah, which I guess in the past, well, even just thinking historically, it's always hard to do if you've got all these different bits and pieces. And I guess infrastructure as code and this new dev-led application development time that we're in, it's all coming together anyway. So, if Snyk can basically see that holistically and then produce reports and scanning across every gamut from start to finish, that's fundamentally different to where we've been in the past with regards to application development, infrastructure deployment, that sort of thing. So I guess you guys are taking advantage of where we are as well today.
Yeah, I mean, if you look at the market, it's quite fragmented. There's a lot of sort of best of breed or bespoke tools in each of those different categories.
Yeah.
You got your check marks and Veracode sort of focusing on the code analysis. You've got your black ducks and your white source sort of focusing on the open source piece. You've got your AppSec and your twist locks focusing more on the containers, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So companies or our customers out there previously would need to choose 4 different vendors to cover all the sort of functions that Snyk is providing. And yeah, some of our products are quite new, like the IAC and the Snyk code, but they're getting heavy investment, and they'll be up to speed with the other vendors out there in those individual spaces. But there is a tremendous value of sort of taking the whole platform, because there's a lot of crossover and insights you can get from all of the different areas, if you will.
Good stuff. So let's talk a little bit about, just to sort of wrap up some of the fundamentals of the industry, right? Like the buzzword, DevSecops. I mean, for the longest time it was DevOps, and then SecOps, and then they've kind of come together in DevSecops. Like we love mashing these sorts of new spaces together, and what it best does is create this sort of FOMO sort of situation. Like, holy crap, DevSecops, I need to know about that, but what is it? So what is it to you guys? What's DevSecops?
Yeah, I think sort of at a high level, it's really thinking about the application security and the infrastructure security, for that matter, at the very start of the development process. Another way of saying this is shifting left. You may have heard of that.
Shift left, okay. Yeah.
But it's not just about that. It's also automating the security gates along the process, so that you can still go fast. So if you look at the software development lifecycle, there's a number of sort of key integration points that you need to think about. So first one is at the IDE, so the developer's tool that they use, things like Visual Studio or VS Code or IntelliJ from the JetBrains, most popular IDE for writing Java code. We want to integrate directly in that tool so developers can get insight about the code they're developing or open source usage that they have right from the start of when they create a project and start building features, right? Almost in real time, before they check in any code into the source control, because it's cheaper to do it then, right?
Yeah.
But then the next piece is around the source control itself, right? So think of GitHub, developers checking in stories, checking in code after developing stories into the repository, along with other teams and other developers checking in the same place. You want to scan the security at that point as well, because things may not get caught on the IDE, the developer, when the developer's writing the code, especially in the context with everyone else's code. When you start building the project, there might be other security concerns that sort of pop up. So you need to scan it there. Once you get through that, you're probably going to use some sort of CI/CD tool to automate the building and the integration testing and the deployment of the code itself. So we need to check the code again there. This is when your typically containers start getting built.
Yep.
From the definitions that's in the repo, and we would have got an idea of any security vulnerabilities from that Docker file. But there are other ways of building containers that don't have a definition. You may have heard of cloud native build packs. This is basically building from source. So given your source code, I'm going to build a container for you. But I think folks are still sort of relying on that Docker file definition. Either way, what we want to do is scan the container after it's been built as well.
Yeah.
Typically, folks will use a container registry. So, if you're using GCP, GCR, Google Container Registry, there's the equivalent on Amazon and Azure as well. And we want to connect to those registries and sort of scan the container images before they get deployed. Okay. And then finally, once those containers get deployed into a prod-like environment, or even in production, probably to like a Kubernetes environment, we want to actually connect to the cluster and scan those containers again there, because there is a chance they get changed. There's configuration drift, or like in the SolarWinds example, people were able to inject a malicious payload after the package had been built, right?
Okay.
So we want to check it again when it gets into production. And then, of course, we also want to check the infrastructure as code scripts before we deploy anything to production. So I guess to sort of come back to the DevSecops, it's automating all those sort of touch points and integration points along the whole SDLC, so that it doesn't cause friction, and developers can basically do what they have always done, even though the security piece is there.
Yeah.
But deploy quickly, deploy often, but stay secure.
Yeah. And you've kind of highlighted a new acronym for me, which is CNAS, or Cloud Native Application Security. So this is the world, right? This is the world that we're in now. Cloud Native Application Security. It's where Snyk lives, and the role of the security person has changed a little bit in this new world. I mean, what's your biggest take on how that role has changed in terms of CNAS?
Yeah, I mean, many security folk out there may feel a little bit threatened, I guess, that the developer's getting all this power, but they really should embrace it. You see a lot of organizations now setting up what's called an AppSec team.
Yeah. Okay.
Which is obviously the collaboration between the applications and security teams, and it's a whole new career path for folks who specialize in AppSec, application security, which is the role of that team really is to stand up and support the tooling and the infrastructure for the developers, so they can have a good security posture, right? And it's educating developers on what good security looks like in their code. So I would say these folks are sort of cross developers, cross infrastructure, cross security people. So probably a bit of a unicorn, but security folks who sort of want to also get into scripting and programming, I think that's a good career path.
Yeah, I think, yeah, it's interesting you mentioned like fear of, developers taking over their jobs. Because I think to a certain extent, you look at the other side of that in the infrastructure and platform side, and there's certainly that feeling with a lot of more traditional, infrastructure guys where they feel like developers are coming and cutting into their turf. And if you can't code, then you're pretty much on the scrap heap. So it's an interesting that from the security side of things, there's similar sentiment taking place, right? So I think the biggest takeaway from that is that we all have to evolve a little bit. We all have to understand the world that's changing, that's being driven by the software, and then obviously because it's software driven, devs have more relevance. But then we also need to be aware end to end of what that actually means from a platform deployment perspective, an ongoing maintenance perspective, a security perspective. So yeah, these worlds are coming together, which is why I guess these acronyms are coming together as well. DevSec, Plat, Ops, Sec, whatever it's going to be next, right? It's quite interesting. So let's just wrap up by focusing back on Snyk again, and maybe just a question I ask many companies I have on the show is how did you guys disrupt the market initially? What was that sort of moment, or that sort of moment of disruption that people go, okay, well, let's take Snyk seriously?
Yeah, I think it goes back to Guy Pajani's vision around being a dev first security company. I mean, one of the main reasons I joined Snyk is, and I don't have a strong security background. I've been there, and it's been present in the sort of projects I've done and the companies I've worked for, but I wouldn't say I'm a security expert. Yeah. Right? I come from definitely more the software engineering discipline and sort of cloud architecture, that type of world. But you kind of you can't ignore security these days, right? And probably back when I was coding 10 years ago, maybe you could sort of get away with it. And I hate to think how much of my code actually had vulnerabilities that did go to production.
Don't look.
But I never got hacked, so that was the main thing. But these days, obviously cybersecurity attacks are happening more and more often, so you can't take the risk. But no, I mean, I think the reason why Snyk got such rapid adoption is that it was built for developers by developers, so that they're quite familiar with the tooling. As I said, it's sort of almost invisible, doesn't get in their way, but it's there when they need it, right? And it's advising them on maybe how they should refactor the code, or maybe choose different libraries, for example, or how they should construct containers, right? It's there as sort of a coach. Whereas traditionally in this market, the other tooling vendors provide these hard gates, and they would send back, a spreadsheet, if you will, with thousands of lines of vulnerabilities in it to the developer to go fix the code. And without any context of the project or the application, or where that code lives, or why I need to change it, right? And most developers would just bin that, right? But Snyk sort of goes one step further. Not only is it integrated in the tools, it does this process called auto remediation, right? Okay. So if there's a vulnerability, it will create a pull request in the source control system, such as GitHub, such that the developer need only sort of accept or reject the pull request, right? And what it does is, in the case of open source, we figure out what is the next safest version of a library that has been patched, that is a minor sort of release, not a major, because that may cause breakages, but what is the safest minor release where the vulnerability has been patched, right? We do the heavy lifting to sort of work that out for the developer, because it can be quite complicated, right? As I said before, you've got your direct dependencies in the application, but most of the vulnerabilities exist within the what we call transient or indirect dependency, and there could be thousands of those, right? You don't really know what's there, but providing this sort of bill of materials, or this view on the dependency and where the actual vulnerabilities are, and providing that sort of auto pull request removes 95% of the heavy lifting for developers, and they love it, and that's why they use it, because the work is the hard work is done for them.
Yeah, and that's again, I think it's best shown in the demo videos, because there's one specific example there where there's someone writing their code, they've integrated into Visual Studio Code, they do a check using Snyk, it basically highlights a vulnerability in a particular build of an open source component. They go in there, they change the version number to the one that Snyk says is the one that's been patched, and pretty much happy days from there. So yeah, I'll definitely link to that and show you that. That's great. I think you've talked about how you've disrupted. It's pretty plain to see how you guys are looking for future disruption. You guys are growing at a tremendous rate. So I was really happy to have you guys on and kind of bridge a bit of the gap between, firstly my understanding of what you guys do, but then I think for people listening, in that traditional infrastructure space, what exactly you guys offer. And make no mistake, there's going to be intersection between these worlds moving forward. It's just going to happen, right? That's the way software is eating the world. Businesses are relying on software more and more. Security has become an issue, malicious intent, insider attack, the sophistication of ransomware. It's just the time. So Snyk's there at the right time for that. So now you know. I was waiting to say that. So yeah, that rolled off way too easy.
That's the way to end.
Yeah, there you go. Top work there. All right. So I'll just wrap up. I think I wanted to. I saw that you guys have got a conference coming, SnykCon in 2021. It's online, but that's in October 5th. Just maybe a quick plug for that, and then I'll wrap up.
Yeah, definitely sign up. Come along. You'll hear some of our key folks in the organization, Guy Bajani and a few other execs speaking at that event, as well as international and local customer speakers that we have from Snyk. So you get some good insights into how some of our customers are using Snyk at scale within the region. Customers like Afterpay, Atlassian are customers. So we've got some good brand names there as well.
Awesome. Good stuff, mate. No worries. Well, look, that was a great conversation. I really enjoyed it. Again, if you'd like to appear on Great Things with Great Tech, you can click on the link on the show notes. In the show notes, again, I will list everything that we've talked about with regards to the demos and a little bit more information about Snyk in general. Again, if you aren't subscribed or you're new to the show and you like what you hear, please click the subscribe button and catch up on all previous episodes on either YouTube or on the podcast platforms. And with that, I'd like to thank Lawrence and thank Snyk, and we will see you next time on Great Things with Great Tech.
Cheers, Anthony. Thank you.
Cheers, mate. All right. Good. Let me stop the recording.